off, or you something goes wrong, just know that everybody on the call and everybody who registered will receive automatically the link to the recording. So that will just happen. All right. Well, go ahead.
I would like to say that if anything unexpected happens, like if someone comes in this meeting that shouldn't be in the meeting, like Dani will just end the meeting immediately, and check your email for a link to log back into the meeting, just because that happens sometimes. And the best and the safest thing for everybody to do is for us to immediately end the meeting.
Okay.
Okay.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So for the most part, what we'll do is we'll just, gosh, we don't need Zoom etiquette talks at this point in our lives, but everybody will, pretty much stay on mute. I will make pauses for questions. You are welcome at any time to type thoughts or questions for me into the chat, and I'll do my best to notice those. I might not notice them until I stop to take questions, so just bear with me and know that I'm going to do my best to go back and forth, but I will leave time at the end for sure for questions. So if I didn't get to you or something got missed, because once Lashana hops off, I'm going to kind of wear two hats here. So just, yeah, but I'll do my best to get to everybody. And I'm thinking we'll go about 2 hours tonight. I know usually these webinars are about an hour to an hour and 20 minutes, and I think we'll go longer than that. So again, if that's too long, you will get the recording. Yeah, I think that's it. I will just go ahead and start sharing my screen. Oh. Oh, and it's, of course, there we go. And is it working? All right. Okay, so like we said, we're here, we're going to talk about home funerals for death doulas. Oh, and one thing that I like to say when we've been doing this so long, teaching on Zoom is rough. I am definitely someone who really enjoys feeling you while I teach you, energetically, I mean. And so it's been a really interesting adjustment to teach to a screen rather than to bodies in the room. And so one thing that I have noticed that helps me when I'm teaching over Zoom is if those of you that are on with your video, it's actually great. And I work really hard to make eye contact with those of you that I can see while I'm teaching. And so anything that you do with your face to give me verbal cues, like, oh, I understand, yeah, like nodding your head or leaning in and things, just like the same verbal cues that we talk about when we're in person with each other, how we signal connection with our bodies and with our faces. If something's not working for you, I don't mind if you lean back and kind of shake your head and make a scrunched up face, and I'm gonna read that and know that you need me to say something differently. So obviously I can't see everybody at the same time while I'm going through my slides, but those of you, and I kind of do a thing where I'll click on it and scroll through and check on your faces. And that's how I do my work of staying connected with you. And it keeps that feedback circle going where I know that you're sending me some messages on how things are landing by your body language. And even though we're all so far away from each other, that little bit can be really helpful. So I welcome you. I'm Dani LaVoire, board member of the National Home Funeral Alliance. The NHFA welcomes you so much. We thank you for continuing to plug into what we're offering, and just knowing that, you know, when you register for these webinars, you're also helping us to continue to offer home funeral education in the communities around the country. So thanks for being here. So I want to just start by, you can type this into the chat box. You know, I'll give, you know, a few minutes if people want to raise a hand. And I'm just curious, I'm assuming that many of you are death doulas, that's the capacity that you're here as, for the most part. And so I'm curious, to hear, I know some death doulas who do almost all paperwork. I know some death doulas who do almost all legacy review. And so it's been really interesting for me to pull together an understanding of the different ways that death doulas serve their communities. So if people want to drop some things into the chat or raise a hand and I can see you, what are some ways that you approach the practice of being a death doula? What do you offer and what do you receive, whether it's money, whether it's the ways that it feeds your soul? I'd love to hear, and I'll call on a few people and we'll read the chat and we'll see where this goes. End of life coaches are here as well. That's great. What are some things that you offer? And what do you receive? Are people working as volunteers? Are you finding ways to get paid for your wonderful work? Mainly grief support through the expressive arts, also supporting people via email and phone. And that was Michelle. Wonderful. And I can't see if anybody's raising their hand. Okay. Home funeral guide supporting the family-led process. Thanks, Rhonda. So I think it's just important for us to note that we approach this work from so many different places. Karen says, ooh, I scrolled too much. Does a huge variety: educator, workshops, presentations, planning, support, vigil, home funeral guide, grief support, natural burial consultant, paid and unpaid. Yeah, so there's so many things: holistic, advanced care planning, community education, bedside presence, nonprofit, sliding scale, and donations. Thanks, Elizabeth. Assisting during medical aid and dying, supporting the patient and especially their family. Lori charges for it according to their ability to pay as a package for the entire experience. Paid advanced care planning. Great. And the reason that I asked this, like I said, is because it's a conversation that we have a lot as on the home funeral side as well. Who is offering their services, their education as volunteer work? Who is doing community education and then hoping that families have gleaned enough from those settings to go ahead and feel like they have what they need to do to assist, for themselves, which is a lot of the times what we're working towards. So I think it's interesting to see how that blends. So it sounds like death doulas are asking similar questions. What exactly are the services that we're offering? How do we get compensated and feel like we're being filled up in the ways we need to be filled up, the same way that we're offering lots of ourselves in doing this work? Let's see. Okay, so okay. So this is one of my favorite quotes when we're talking about the essence of why we think home funerals are important. So I'll say this: I'm going somewhat from an assumption that some of you are here not totally understanding exactly what a home funeral is. So I'm going to really start with just the basics of what a home funeral is, what you can offer and why, and then move into some deeper questions about where the work of the home funeral guide and the death doula overlap, and some reasons that I think that home funerals are a really important part of community care. So Beth Knox, who was one of the people whose story fed the beginning of the National Home Funeral Alliance. This is a great quote from her. It's this idea that there's a comfort and a healing that comes from physically caring for the dead and from spending quiet, private time in the presence of death. It's a tremendous help in the bereavement process and helps you see death as a natural part of the life cycle. So obviously this isn't the case for everybody. And a lot of what we're focusing on in the National Home Funeral Alliance and in home funeral education is really this idea that it's not our job to make everybody want to have a home funeral, but it's really important that people know that they can. It's important that people understand that there's a right to have a home funeral, that your right to have a home funeral is inherently protected. And whether you choose one or not is not for us to judge or have really an opinion about. But the education piece is really just making sure that people know that it's possible. So we'll just start with the basics. Why would you ever want to have a home funeral? And I say this, you know, for those of us that are in this work, it can feel really obvious, but it's not too many steps outside of the circle of ourselves when people start to think like, what? That sounds, you know, my mother, when my grandmother was dying, and I told her that I wanted to bring grandma's body home from the hospital, you know, before it had happened. She was like, you want to do what in my house? And this idea of bringing a body from outside the home into the home, if they haven't died at home, can be a really strange idea for people who haven't heard that possibility before. So the basics, it's legal. In every state, it's legal to have a home funeral. Some states require you to hire professionals for different aspects of the work, and I'll be more specific about that in a little bit. But in every state, it is legal to care for the body of your loved one at home or your community member. Home funerals give more options for being softer on the earth. So you can certainly have a home funeral for an embalmed body. There's no reason not to do that. But in many cases, people are more informed and realize that embalming is not required. And so they choose less invasive procedures, both for the body as well as, you know, making things homemade and things that are less resource intensive when thinking about ways to bury the body. Again, that's not to say that you have to be eco-conscious to have a home funeral, but it's just something that a lot of people who are thinking about home funerals tend to take into consideration. Home funerals are also cost conscious. So, you know, one of the things that I'm sure we're all aware of is the burden of the expense of the conventional funeral. These days, they can be upwards of $7,000 to $10,000. And home funerals do a really great job of making things less expensive for families. There's that real DIY mentality about it. There's lots of options and opportunities to do things for yourself that in other situations you might end up paying a professional. Home funerals can be satisfying and comforting. Again, they can be. The time that you get to spend with the body, the drawn out timeline allows you to feel all the different feels, not feel like you have to rush through any emotion that might come up. And so I like to use the word satisfying, especially when I'm talking about grief, because so many times, especially in, you know, the more conventional culture, grief is one of the bad feelings. And so, you know, when you're talking to people in your communities, it might not register right away when you start talking about having, you know, a positive experience of grief or really understanding what that would mean, besides just, I want to stop feeling this icky feeling as quickly as possible. And so I think about grief as a feeling that we need to find ways to experience in a more satisfying way, like when we can encapsulate it in a cozy couch or with inside of a community that knows how to bear witness to what we're feeling. That's satisfying. It's like there's a feeling, there's an urge, and it's met. And that's all I mean by satisfying. So I don't want anybody to take that as like, this grief is going to have this amazing resolution. But to me, what satisfying means is there's an urge, there's like a natural response, and you meet it. And so much in our culture right now is not set up to meet grief in a way that we can access a satisfying fulfillment of it. And so that's what I mean when I say home funerals really facilitate more of a satisfying experience of grief. And I will talk about that again more later. They're family-led or they're community-led. And so that can make a really big difference for people. There's reports of people sometimes when they're working with funeral directors, you're sort of handing over the agency of the experience to the professional. And some people really want that, and that should be honored when that's what they need. but we'll talk a little bit more later about what happens sort of in the nervous system response when you feel like you've had the agency and the control and the decision making, how you then perceive yourself as having been useful. And therefore, it can impact the way that your body remembers living through the experience of the loss. So allowing the people who are the bereaved to lead, to make the decisions, and to do the work can lead to that satisfying grief. Home funerals, really the bottom line is that they allow you to spend time with the body. We're going to talk about all different kinds of things that a home funeral can be or maybe isn't, but really the essence of it is, how do you create more time with the body? So whether it's a straightforward death where somebody was on hospice and they died in their bed and the family comes and, you know, this is this like idyllic home funeral experience that we talk about, and forget then that if there's been a medical examiner, if there's been an accident, if someone is houseless, all of the different ways that people meet death and their situations when they meet death, there are ways to spend time with their body, whether it's in a funeral home, a church, a community center. There's no limit to where you can spend time with that body. And have all of these positive effects available to you if they work for you while being with that body, even if it's not sort of the story that gets told a lot, which is this peaceful death on hospice. There's lots of, you know, I work with families a lot who have infant deaths and have stillbirths. And so those are, you know, very traumatic and unexpected. And spending time with the body, especially in those situations, can be really important. And then, as I said, sort of with the satisfying, because the time is not limited and you're not like, okay, I have to be at the funeral home at 1 o'clock, so I got to get my you know, grieving pants on and like get all ready to perform exactly the right amount of grief so that people can see me. The spacious time really allows the grief to be a journey, and for all of the complicated things that start to come up in a way that they don't need to be judged and analyzed so quick, because you're trying to move through them at a pace. But that longer timeline of the home funeral lets the complicated things have more room to do what they need to do. And by the complicated things, I mean the complicated feelings. I keep unclicking. There we go. Okay, so a home funeral might include caring for a loved one at home, church, or other place that allows privacy and comfort. Bathing, anointing, or dressing a body. A home funeral can include professionals if you want to. So a lot of times, the question is really, through which doorway are you entering the desire to have a home funeral? Is it because you can't afford a conventional funeral? And so most of what you're doing is really with this DIY mentality of like, I gotta file the death certificate by myself. I've got to transport the body by myself. I've got to make a casket because I can't afford it any other way. That's one doorway. If you're entering it through the doorway of like, it's not the money, it's the time for the grief, then maybe you're more interested in paying a professional to file the paperwork for you or to do the transportation for you and make that easier so that you really get to steep in the time with the body and you don't want to be distracted with the paperwork part. So professionals, and we're going to talk about this a lot more, that it's really important, as I'm just going to lump us all in as community death care advocates. You know, whether you're a death doula or a home funeral guide, what we're doing is we are doing the work of improving the way that people meet death in the places where we live. So having those relationships with really wonderful funeral directors in your area is what makes this option possible and really allows the families that we're helping to access exactly what it is that they're looking for. you can have a viewing or a vigil at your home or the church or the funeral home or wherever your community is comfortable gathering. So oftentimes what will happen is a family might spend some more personal time with the body and then invite the greater community to come and see, just as if just as if it was a more conventional mainstream funeral where there's a viewing at the funeral home. You can do all of the work yourself to prepare the body to be seen by your community. You can have a funeral gathering or not have a funeral gathering. Some people, it's really important to them to recreate exactly what it would feel like, that whole thing where people come up and talk and somebody offers prayers and the body is present, and you can do that at your home or church or whatever that gathering place is, that is the space that your community uses. You can file paperwork on your own. You can, in most states, you can transport the body on your own. You can build, paint caskets, and create shrouds. And you can spend time with the body in a way that makes sense for the individuals involved. So again, this is the nuts and bolts here of what home funerals can be. And none of this really takes very specific knowledge of how to, we joke around about, the how to use a washcloth demonstration that we offer sometimes in NHFA land. And it's important to go through the motions and get yourself comfortable with the ideas of what happens. But all of these things are things that someone who has the right support and feels the agency to take on this work at end of life, there's not a task here on this list that you need special training for or a license to be able to handle in a way that's safe from a public health perspective, from a mental health perspective. All of these things are accessible. Here's a picture from a home funeral that our very own Sarah Cruz did a few years ago. And this is the art that was made on the top of the cardboard casket. And then the woman couldn't bear to put this beautiful piece of artwork into the crematory, my mind is what that thing's called, the retort. And so she kept it and keeps it on her mantle now as a memory of the beauty that was created around her husband's death. Here are some other great images of the family coming together, the kids being involved, and the ability to make caskets together and things like that. It really, having a job to do is really important when the hard stuff starts to happen. And I'll talk about that more in a little bit. And this is not new. So home funerals have been the way that humans have met death for over 40,000 years. And it's been a very short time in our human history that we have paid people to take that work from our hands and out of our sight. And so, I think a lot when my grandmother I talk about my grandma a lot when I'm teaching. And when she was getting towards the end of her life, she would laugh at me because we would talk a lot about how I wanted to care for her body after she died. And she would say, she's like, "You think you made this up? I remember when I was a little girl," and she's a New York Jewish accent, and that, she remembered having her uncle's body on the kitchen table being a little kid. And then she thought that I was, because I was part of this nonprofit, that I thought that we, had this great new idea that we were going to do this. And she just thought that was so funny. And I assured her that clearly I didn't think that I had made it up. But I think it's really powerful to look at, some of the ways that we struggle with grief and depression and other forms of challenges in our culture right now, and to look at these important moments that have been taken from us, taken from our sight, taken from our work, and how can we weave some of this meaning And when I say meaning, I just mean like the knowing that we can do hard things. And how will that affect, our general approaches to mental health as a community moving forward when we have ways to weave grief into our lives. Here's some more photos. Home funerals are legal. And you can see down here at the bottom, those are the states that that do require you to use a funeral director to some degree, whether it's transporting the body or filing paperwork. Those are usually the two things that a state would require the use of a funeral director for. Like in New York, when my grandmother died, we had to hire the funeral director to pick her body up from the hospital and carry it back to my mother's house. But it wasn't hard to find a very friendly funeral director who was willing to do that work for us. They were super respectful. They are legal in every state and province. 9 states require a director for signing the death certificate or transportation, and embalming is not required by law in any state. And so, again, probably many of you know that because you're doing this work, but this is probably the biggest aha moment that I have happen when I'm teaching in communities. So I do a lot of work, teaching about home funerals where I live, and I do some traveling, and everywhere I go, people think that embalming is required, and they think that because a funeral director has told them that. So something to really get clear on where you live, and to make sure that you're weaving into your education. Home funerals are safe. They are safe for caregivers and the deceased. According to the CDC, a death body does not pose an increased health risk. You can keep the body cool with ice or with air conditioning. And there's no need for embalming or disinfecting. So when we're washing the body, it's very much a ceremonial washing. It's a having a task to do, but it's not about a need for the body to be clean. And then just use universal precautions when necessary. So if you are going to handle a body, whatever universal precautions you were using when the person was alive and you were their caregiver is what you should use when you're handling their body. Same goes if there was an accident and you weren't being their caregiver. If this is a person that you would touch without gloves and put a kiss on their face, then there's no need for you to use gloves or anything when handling the body. You might notice that I go back and forth between language of you doing this yourself. Mostly when I'm teaching as if the people that I'm talking to are the family that's going to be doing the home funeral. Many of you, especially as death doulas, are going to be doing this work as a death doula, trying to assist a family to feel confident to have a home funeral on their own. And we're going to talk about the legalities and things there in a minute. So obviously, if this isn't your family, and you might choose to wear gloves and use some universal precautions, and that's just more within your comfort zone. But unless the person died of the plague or Ebola, even with coronavirus right now, where you would use universal precautions and gloves and things like that. But because it's not airborne, the bodies don't pose a great risk. It would be more if the droplets, if you got them on your hands and then delivered them into your nasal passages. But the body, because it's not respirating, it's not putting droplets out any longer. Okay, with proper care, fluids and odors, if they are present, are managed easily. So yes, the body some drool might come out of the mouth, or some of the pores on the body might start to sweat. Some urine or feces might come out of the body. That was like the last bit that was in there. And just as when they were alive, it's completely safe and respectful to the body to just clean up those messes the same that you would in life. So you can, use some disinfectant spray if needed to manage the odors, clean them up, take those things out of the room, and all will be well. You can wash with soap and water. You can anoint with essential oils if desired, and that's a really great old wisdom, because lots of the essential oils are calming for those of us who are caring for the body and might need some regulation of our nervous system. They will help to slow down decomposition by disinfecting a little bit. And they can help keep the room fresh if there are some odors that are less than pleasant starting to surround the body. And we recommend just keeping the body cool with dry ice, Techni ice, or gel packs. Techni ice is like these little squares, and they're kind of fun because you can cut them into different shapes. Like, let's say there is a wound and you want to keep a little bit of extra ice on that wound, you can cut the ice into different shapes and things like that. You need to be a little bit careful with dry ice and make sure that you have the proper skills because there are just some safety concerns with dry ice. It's not my preference just because it's like a whole nother thing to think about. But when my grandmother died, we weren't really prepared for it. And we just used frozen water bottles. My mom was one of those people that likes frozen water bottles in her freezer, and so that she could like go run her errands and have her cold water. So I was like, sorry, Mom. And I got all of her frozen water bottles and we just packed them around my grandma's belly, and it worked just fine. Okay, I'm gonna just take a quick peek at the chat and see if anybody has something that they need me to address so far, if I can figure out how to do it. Yes, we'll get into some stuff about paying for it. I see Nidra talking about COVID. Yeah, great idea to put a mask over the person's face. I think that's a really good thing to think about. Real quick.
Dani, I can't stay on for the entire thing, but if you want me to help you by tracking the chat box,
that would be great, Sarah.
I can do that.
And then you can pull up, yeah, if something's really timely and you think I need to address it, that would be great, because there's a lot going on in here.
Yeah. Adrienne was asking about data that supports spending time with the body, how that supports grief. I'm not sure if that study has been done. I think a lot of that is more anecdotal, that people who have shared their experiences with a home funeral have said that just being able to be present with the body has been very much of a satisfying experience. Let's see.
And I'll talk about that a little bit when I talk about this, more looking at it from like a trauma care perspective and different things that, so it's not specifically the studies around that, but there is some science around trauma and the things that help integrate trauma.
Great. Looks like that's coming right up.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Why don't I go ahead and then just keep moving?
Yeah.
And I bet I'm just in scrolling through, I think a lot
of
and
then questions around, whether you can touch the body. Apparently in Alberta, you're not supposed to at all. Whether that's something that, as long as the family gives you permission, that you can do so, but have that not charged for that piece.
Yeah.
Mainly it's about guiding the family to do it themselves. So.
Yep. And Sarah, I'm just going to make you a host too, just so you can help me.
Okay.
More. Okay, great. So thanks. Just wanted to peek in and make sure nobody was having like a big, like, this isn't working or something's going on. Okay. So home funerals so I will say this from the beginning, my favorite thing. So everybody kind of gets excited about being a home funeral educator for different reasons, right? And for me, trauma work is why I love home funerals. And so whoever that was that posted that question about the data, if we want to like get together in a few days or something and have a deeper conversation, like, it's not data that I have, but I have a lot of experience and anecdotal stories and things. And so one of the things, and I'll just tell real quickly because I think stories are a great way to learn. My history, I come to this work as a home birth midwife. So I've been doing births for 20 years and had no idea that death education was ever going to be something that I was interested in until 2008, when I attended my first stillbirth. And what I realized in that experience was, that my midwifery training gave me zero skills in how to facilitate an experience for this family and their community that would help people just not feel completely lost. you know, I don't even want to say healing or meaningful, like even just the baseline of like, these people were expecting a baby, their friends were expecting a baby, and that didn't happen, and everyone was just a mess. And these were people who had skills, like other skills, you know, they were friends for a long time, they did lots of communication classes in college at their very awesome liberal arts college, and there was a lot missing in the way that this community was able to come together. Actually, they weren't able to come together around this family. And so what I saw was, first of all, as a midwife, my own panic around, and shame really, around not knowing how to facilitate something that felt helpful. And then watching the friends of this couple fall away because we were all so lost on how to do grief well. And, you know, this was 12 years ago. So, you know, I think right now there's a lot of great stuff on the internet that if this was going on in your community, you could Google and find things, but that wasn't really the case 12 years ago. And so it was really hard. It was really traumatic to have this horrible thing happen and watch a community fall apart and watch this couple really spiral into substance abuse and mental health crises because they didn't have the support that they needed. And so I had this screaming, really, it felt like screaming intuition when we went to the hospital for them to birth the baby, that she needed to bring her baby home. And I'm going like, what? Self? Like, are you crazy? Like, I don't even know if that's legal. I don't know if that's like, who like says like, I'm going to bring my dead baby home from the hospital. That just seemed nuts to me, but yet there was an intuition saying that it was really important. And since then, obviously, Sarah Cruz and I were drinking wine together back at the Raven all those years ago, and she turned me on to this work. And since then have had so many opportunities to help people spend time with the bodies, especially of people who have died in a traumatic way or in a sudden way. And the difference that it makes to get that slow time with the body is really impressive. So I'm going to keep going on that. But that's sort of the backdrop. So they diminish trauma because they give you more time. They allow for a natural flow of events and emotions. They normalize and diminish fears. So a lot of times what we imagine death to be like and what it is are really different. And that's not to say that if it's been an accident, that is the same across the board of just seeing a dead body. But there are ways to shroud a body that's been in an accident. So maybe it's just a hand that somebody can interact with, or maybe the body is changed so much that seeing it isn't isn't what the family would want. But even having its presence there shrouded can make a really big difference because it's physical. It's physical. When we are stuck in our heads trying to process, that's where our emotions get stuck because we're too mental. But when we do things that drop the work of our process and of our emotions into our bodies, that's when they can move in a way that is less traumatic and has more opportunities for growth. Children can be involved. So the death where children can be involved helps to teach children about the life cycle, which can then, again, like it just paints a little bit of a more, in situations where it's appropriate, a more full circle. It feels better when there's children there, because there's something about it where you can reflect on death is not wrong. Death is not something we shouldn't have. Here are the children sort of grounding us in the reality that there are cycles. We watch children come to grips with something that maybe on the abstract was so hard for them to think would be okay to be in the same room as. And then all of a sudden these children are like these little wise warriors. My daughter, we were in a store around Halloween time, and she was about 7, and she said, I don't understand why people think cemeteries are scary. She said, I'm only 7 years old and I helped put my grandma's body in the ground and bury her. So it's this thing where the more they're exposed, the less they're afraid. And I think that goes for adults as well, but we can just lean on the stories of the children. Thank you for clapping, Nidra. I'm seeing you and you're keeping me going. It helps us integrate grief and loss, right? So again, I really want us to be careful as educators when we use words like healing, or, you know, that it's beautiful, that our home funerals are beautiful, because sometimes they are, but they aren't always. Sometimes it's not a situation that you can find a good feeling around. And so we need to be really careful as we're teaching to use words like integrate grief and loss rather than home funerals are healing, right? Maybe they are. And what is healing when there's death and grief, right? Like, I think they give us time, and I think I said this down here somewhere, they give us time to notice how we've changed, right? Which maybe we used to call meaning making, right? But even that, it's like so much pressure to put on a person. Like, now you have to like deal with your grief and you have to make meaning about it, right? So rather than putting that on people, that like the next step is meaning making, what you want to do is you want to draw out the time so that you can notice, so you can integrate grief and loss into your life. Because those of us who have been in grief, especially big losses, we know that you don't get over it. You don't get back to being the person that you were. It's about the ways that we let this experience change us. And then our job is to just notice who we are. Notice what we've experienced, notice these new emotions that are happening, and have the time to be seen by good people and grow into a new person. And to me, that is integrating the grief and loss. You might call that healing. Maybe that's what healing is, but that's a really big word. Giving people a chance to be useful is a really big deal. So there are some, I feel like there's studies, but now I'm like, are they studies? Where there, you know, there's at least anecdotes from places like Haiti when the hurricane happened, or the earthquake happened rather. And in the first days, people were working and digging through the rubble and moving their bodies. And it was really hard, but they had something to do. And so they were like, even though they weren't okay, they were okay because they had purpose. Then all the bureaucrats came and said, no, wait online. You got to get your check. You got to report the damage. You got to wait until we tell you what to do and how to do this and how to move this thing. And then that's when people really started to struggle because they stopped being useful. Then they're waiting around for the next task, for the next thing to do. And so I really equate that. There's another story that my friend tells about a bus accident, and the people who couldn't get out of the bus, even though they were in the same part for the trauma, the people that were able to get out and ask for help had better outcomes than the people who were unable to get out and ask for help, and because of being useful. And so it's this idea that when something hard is happening, if you can use your body and be useful, you're actually filing in your brain the memory of the hard thing that happened next to a memory of yourself being useful. And it changes the way we grow from an experience when we see ourselves as worthy, as strong, as useful. Whereas if the theater that I would do if we were in the room together was sort of like this pacing, like, oh, it's 2 o'clock yet, like 2 o'clock's when I get to go to the funeral home. And I'm sort of like waiting to make sure that I show up exactly the right way so that the people who are there will see me grieve just the right amount. And what if I don't cry and everybody sees me not crying? And there's all this mental anguish. And you spend all that time waiting. I don't really want to go back to my life, but I'm not doing anything. So that's a very mental place to be stuck while you're waiting for the funeral, while you're waiting for the ceremony, the ritual of letting this person go. But when the body is at home, there's something to do. There's a way to be with the body and take a break, and be with the body and take a break, that integrates the experience and allows us to feel like we have something to do. And there's that line, right? It gives us the time to find the ways that we've changed. When the funeral happens sort of on a conveyor belt, so the person dies, they're gone within the hour, you wait, you know, for the family to fly in, and then you show up at the funeral home a few days later, and you've sort of been in this mental place of like, I feel like the death happened, but there's nothing there in the tangible reality to help my body understand the new truth. I'm still just trying to comprehend it as an abstract thought. We sort of show up at these rituals a little bit disjointed. We're moving through the steps at a prescribed timeline, rather than on this slow meandering path where we get to think about how this death is going to change our life and wonder what's next for us, and be curious about who we might become, and grieve the person that we've been, and change the relationship from one of presence to one of memory. Like, all of these things need to happen. And they happen more easily when there's a body there, time has slowed down, and we get to move through this on our own journey, not on a prescribed timeline. There's a picture of my grandma, oh, and my nephew. I'm going to go back so you can see. And I just love this picture so much. This is my nephew, and we joke a lot because, you know, my mom, who was very, very skeptical about this home funeral idea, even though I'd been doing this work for years, we all knew my kids were going to be okay. You know, my kids, when I leave the house to go to a birthday, say, Mom, are you going to help someone get born, or are you going to go help someone die tonight? That's just, it's very common in my family that, you know, we butcher animals, and there's just death and life around all the time. But my nephews are very mainstream, watch a lot of TV, like very clean, take a bath every night, like just there's nothing out of the ordinary that happens in their sweet little worlds. And this is my little nephew at, I think he's 4 or 5 years old there. He was fine. He looked at the adults, saw that we were okay, that we were sad, but we weren't freaking out, that we were not afraid of grandma. And he actually took flower petals and was making little mandalas on her face and so closely interacting with her. It was amazing to watch this happen. Here's some other, this is, I love this piece right here. So this is my son. At that time, he was 17 years old and having a hard time. He was just getting in a lot of trouble, doing things 17-year-olds do. And, you know, some 17-year-olds get in trouble and they're just, they don't get caught. My kid, he got caught. Every weekend was a journey with that boy. And I was so surprised that my biggest tears when my grandma came was watching my struggling 17-year-old carry his grandmother's body into the house, carry her body out of the house, and then be one of the people who lowered her body into the ground. To see him get it and willing to participate in something that felt so real was an important part of that noticing who we're becoming, right? I can't say what the meaning was for him. It was his experience. But for me, it was like, everything's going to be okay with him, whether it is or not, you know? And now he's 20 and he's great. But taking these pauses, Franco Stachewski says that ritual takes the truth that is already here and makes it apparent. And I have seen that that's what home funerals do. They take the truth of the death, which is already here. It's already in the room. And it says, can you just stay for a minute, death? Like, we're moving so fast right now in this world that we've created. And Death, I really need you to not leave in an hour. I just need you to hang out and help me absorb the truth that is here. The truth that this person I love is gone. The truth that this 17-year-old who's struggling can show up and be a good man for a minute. You know, the truth that this 4 or 5-year-old nephew who watches too much TV can touch a dead human and find something of himself, and whatever else it ends up being for the families that we're serving. But we need Death to be invited into the room a little bit longer for those experiences to happen. Maybe for some people, right? Again, I'm going to say a lot of things that sound like me saying that home funerals are the best or that home funerals are for everybody. And I'm just going to keep reminding us that it's about making sure that people know their rights. These are some reasons that people might resonate with to say, oh, I know my rights and this sounds good. And some people may be like, that's crazy, but I'm glad I know my rights. And then move on. Okay, so we're going to move into really talking about where we meet, right? So that was the overview of home funerals, more or less. There's more, there's always more, but that was your basics. So this is what I really want to dive into a little bit here, right? Roles in the death care continuum, right? There are end-of-life doulas, there are home funeral guides, there are celebrants, there's end-of-life coaches, right? There's all of these different ways to show up for people at end of life. There are some reasons why it's important to divide it neatly and make sure that people understand the different roles, partly as consumers, as people who are, whether it's consumers buying things or the ways that we participate in community. Oh, I might want a celebrant to come, and I didn't even realize there were people out there that can help me create ceremony, because you know, as a white woman in America, I'm a little bit disconnected from the culture that I come from. And so I might need to hire a ceremonialist, a celebrant, to come and help me learn ways to make meaning, because I'm very disconnected from my personal relationship to ancestor. Okay, I didn't know that. So that's here on this chart, right? A home funeral guide is someone who is very skilled and aware, I would say mostly in doing the advocacy work of making sure that families who want to have a home funeral have access to that right. Nobody needs a home funeral guide to show them how to use a washcloth. Sometimes, and those of you who are doulas understand the doula heart, because I know doulas from birth, and what doulas do is they trust. That's my best definition of what a doula is. A doula trusts the process. It's always a good idea to have someone in the room who trusts the process. And I've seen that at birth so many times. Birth happens better when the people in the room are not thinking it's a medical emergency about to happen. It happens better when everybody in the room is going, yep, that's normal. Yep, yeah, you feel like you're gonna die. Yep, that's normal. And bringing it back to like, this feels nuts, but it's actually okay. And that's what you do as doulas, I think, is you say this whole death process, it's not something that we are invited to see very often, because now things happen in hospitals and funeral homes, and we're busy all the time. And our elders are in nursing facilities. So we need somebody like a doula to be in the room and be like, yep, that's normal. This is what we do. This is how we meet it. And home funeral guides do that very specifically around home death care, around how do I spend time with the body? I heard maybe I would want to spend time with the body, but I don't feel comfortable doing that by myself because no one I know has ever done it. So you get to be the person in the room that's like, yep, that's normal. And really, that's all there is to it. So people ask me, I get so many emails, how do I get training to be a home funeral guide? And I can tell you there's programs out there, but really what it is how do you cultivate a relationship to the unknown? How do you cultivate the ability to move through a situation that is not exactly what we're used to navigating, right? Oh, we rolled the body over and some stuff came out of the mouth. okay, I can meet that. I trust. So it's important to see that there's these different roles. And of course, they're going to overlap, right? The lines between the roles we play are blurry, especially when we're participating in community experience. So what I don't want you to take from that graphic is that you're a death doula and you've gone through your death doula training. And now the only way that you can engage in anything that has to do with home funerals is to engage in home funeral training and celebrant training, that you have to take all of these things and blend them together into this perfectly trained self. Because if you're meeting this from the place of, I am the person in my community who understands these different landscapes, of course, sometimes you're going to be doing your death doula work and someone's going to die. And then that family's going to want to keep them at home. And then you're going to help them create a ceremony. And look, you just did all three. And that's fantastic. And I think that in a lot of ways, in the groovy death world that we're all a part of right now on Zoom, all over the world in COVID, right? Like, those are the communities that we want to be a part of, is when we can just show up for people with our skills and with our heart and with our comfort in uncomfortable moments. But there's just a few things, because we do live in a litigious society where there are rules, there are some things we need to understand. So I want your heart and your soul to move really easily between those three bubbles. We'll say there's three on that form, whichever bubbles you can come up with, of understanding paperwork, understanding legacy work, understanding grief work, understanding body care and the laws that surround that, and the policies you might come up against when families want to bring bodies home, and how to make ceremony. Like, yay, know how to do it all, or know which parts of yourself can come and present in those moments. But there's some things you need to understand from a legal perspective. Isn't it great when you hope the slide that's coming next is the slide that comes next? That just happened. I was like, I hope that's the next slide. Okay, so legal considerations for death doulas who are charging for services at the time of death, right? So not all of you charge for your services. You cannot charge for hands-on body care, okay? If you do, you could be called out for practicing funeral directing without a license. The only people who can get paid for touching bodies are licensed funeral directors. Or family, well, no, those don't get paid, excuse me. The only people who can get paid for touching bodies are licensed funeral directors. So you also, in most places, cannot charge fees for making funeral arrangements, because that's what licensed funeral directors do. So if you are present, be a volunteer. Come as a family friend. If they want you to be present at the death, actually your physical body in the room while they are doing the death care. And in my next slide, we'll talk a little bit about contracts and things like that, but you need your wording to be very, very clear. It's the CYA clause, right? The cover your ass clause. You need your contracts or whatever you're dealing with to be very clear that the services that you are being paid for, and the service you're being paid for as a death doula, end at the time of death. So I'm trusting that you all know what you can charge for up until the moment of death. I'm not a doula educator, so that's not my realm. But assuming that y'all know what you can charge for, at the moment of death, you become a volunteer. You become a consultant. So I do a lot. I would say that my very best death work that I offer, and the stuff that I love being there just because I'm a junkie for that energy. But my best work is over the phone. When I have communicated to a family that you can call me anytime, ask me all the questions, but that really the point is that you as the family feel like you did this yourself. So I do a lot of phone consulting when this is happening. People, oh, the hospital won't let me take the body home. They're saying it's illegal. Okay, yeah, put me on the phone with the nurse, or whatever. So I do a lot of that, a lot of phone advocating. And then I get the you know, I can't get her eyes to close. You know, you said that there's something I could do to close the eyes when I was in your class a month ago, and it's not working. Can you talk me through it? And so we talk through how to get the eyes to shut. I love doing this work on the phone. Phone support is fantastic. You can charge fees for education and consultation. And you can be there and be receiving payment for education and consultation. You just cannot touch the body. You are not receiving any money for body care. So that's the biggest thing right there. When you're crossing that line from death doula to home funeral guide, if you want a different title. Okay, this is my favorite, and this is the thing that that we come back to all the time. Do the advocacy work every day so that families can truly find autonomy. Those of you who are NHFA members, I'm super glad that you're here. And I think that, you know, those of you who keep coming to these webinars, this is really, especially as we move into 2021, this is what the NHFA is going to be talking about. Because the more we are invited to do this work of supporting families to care for their own loved ones, we really realize that families can care for their own loved ones. The thing that's hard and where families end up needing the most support is, I went through and told you how the law protects families' rights to care for their own loved ones. It is legal to drive a body home from the hospital. It is legal to file your own death certificates. But in so many places, this information is new. And so you'll get a hospital who will tell a family, no, that's illegal. You can't take the body home. And you're going, yes, I can. But like, I really don't want to advocate for myself. Like, my husband just died. I don't want to advocate for my right to take his body home and drive him home in my car. That's not what I want to do today. And please don't make me enter, you know, a contract under duress. That's Jim Bates language right there, with a funeral home, and make me buy their services because you don't understand my rights. That's a lot of advocating to have to do for yourself when you've just had a loss. So our job as death doulas and home funeral guides is to start to make these connections now with our local hospitals, with our local medical examiners and coroners, with the care facilities in town, and start to make sure that they have policies in place to release bodies to families. Now, that's a hard thing. You know, sometimes we're like, oh, but if I'm getting paid to be an advocate, I don't want it. No, right? The point is that we are, and I don't think anybody would do that, but we are paving the way for families to have access to their rights. And so I really hope that as death doulas, as home funeral guides, we're seeing ourselves as community care activists, at least to a certain degree. And so all of the work that you do as a death doula or as a home funeral guide will be made easier if you do the advocacy work every day, so that really families can find that autonomy of showing up at the hospital saying, I'd like to bring my loved one's body home. And they're like, okay, yeah, here, sign the paper. And it should be that easy. And we are the only people that can make that happen. I've been serving now with the NHFA for almost 4 years. And what I've realized is that a national organization can't do that, because it's about the relationships that you form with the hospital in your town. As a president of the NHFA, I can't work on hospital policies in 50 states because they're all individual. All I can do is try to light a fire under the home funeral guides and the death doulas to go out and do that work. So advocate, advocate, advocate. That is the best thing that you can do for these families. The most distressing calls I get are when people are like, hey, I took your class 2 years ago and you said that I could do this, and now these people are saying that I can't. I just spent 3 days on the phone with the Neptune Society, the medical examiner, and a hospice nurse in Utah because they were telling this family that they couldn't keep the body home. Not even keep the body home, not even transport it, just keep it home. And we figured it out, but that shouldn't happen. And that's our job. All of us here on this call, that's our job. Okay, that's my biggest soapbox. Okay, so examine and adjust contracts and websites so that agreements are very clear. So some of you may be aware of the situation that happened with the lovely death doulas at Full Circle of Living and Dying in the Grass Valley, California area, where the funeral directors tried to say that they had language on their website that made it seem like they were offering funeral type services. And a complaint with their local consumer board was filed, and they needed a lawyer, and the NHFA helped them out a bunch. Sarah Cruz, remind me if you can remember it, the Institute for Justice, I think that's it. They stepped in with lawyers. So things are going fine for them right now, but the wording is really important. So comb through your website if you're offering after death care. Really examine your contracts and just make sure that the wording that's in there is very in line with, you do not charge for after death care. You don't offer funeral arranging services. You're a death doula, you get paid for those services, and then you offer education and consulting around how to care for your own loved ones. You are empowering families to care for their own loved ones after death. Offer to be a volunteer for after death support. That's a great way to, build good relations in your community. So if you do volunteer work, your community will support you. Remember what I said about phone. Do your work on the phone, because there is so much that you can do, and it doesn't take too much of your time to be available by phone. Charge for education and consultation. Hold the knowing that this is about who does the work of caring. This is not about getting the job done, right? If we just wanted to get the job done of getting the body in the ground or in the crematorium, then we would pay the funeral directors to do it. This is not just about getting the work done. This is about really supporting people to have an experience of doing death care. Right, okay, so this is, what might a death doula do to offer home funeral education or guide support, right? So this is that call that I get. I want to be a home funeral guide. How do I get trained, right? First, just learn about it. Read tons of stories and do the work that you need to do to trust death. I really felt like the training that I had as a birth midwife made me able to be a home funeral guide. I was used to advocating for families in a realm where people were trying to tell them that they didn't have the rights that we all knew that they had. I was used to bodies and fluids and things like that. And so I didn't take a very traditional path to learning. I think people who do farm work are also like, this is just comes really natural to us. And so I think it's really about examining where you are and what skills and comforts you already have, and then learning how to stretch that out a little bit. It's really important to admit to families. I mean, I was doing home funeral education before I had ever seen a dead body, except that baby, obviously. But before I had ever attended a home funeral, I was doing home funeral education. And I was being really clear with people that I've never done this before, but mostly what I'm doing is I know your rights. And so if you approach it from this place of, I know my rights, I know your rights, I understand the system. And so do your work of understanding the system and start putting yourself in the stream. And then you'll be invited to a home funeral for a friend because they've been hearing you talk about this stuff for so long. And you go in very, very humble and very, very clear on what your skills are and what you've done before. And you've got my number on speed dial, or whoever your home funeral buddies are who have maybe had a little more experience. And that's what we do. We help each other. Those of you who are death doulas who might be putting your toe in this stream, put my number in your phone. Put Sarah Cruz's number in your phone. We're here to help with these questions. And that's how this work gets spread. Know the laws in your state and the political and policy climate of your hometown. So realizing that the law and the policies might not reflect each other. And so first you really understand the law, and then you start having conversations with people in the hospital to say, hey, I understand that this is the law. Can you show me the ways that your policies are in line with that? And this is going to be a process. This is not something that they're like, oh, you're right. Wow, we didn't know. Like, we're going to do that right now. It's going to be hard, and it's going to take some work to find somebody who cares enough to do it. And in our hospital, we were lucky enough that the person on the ethics board was really interested. And we had a labor and delivery nurse who was very, thought it was very important that families knew that they could bring bodies home of deceased babies. And so with those two allies, we've done a lot of work here in our local hospital to make things better for families who want to bring bodies home. But it's about building relationships. And you're going to get way more no's than you're going to get yeses right at first. So stick with it. Know the edges of your comfort zone, right? We did, those of you who were with me when we spoke with Elisa Chase, the celebrant, a few months ago, she was great, and she was so candid, and she said, I love being here talking to you, and I don't do dead bodies. That was just her edge. Creates amazing, officiates at funerals, totally supports families at end of life, but her comfort zone ends at being in the room with a dead body. That's okay. You can still advocate for families' rights to care for their own loved one after death and never be willing to be in the room with a dead body. That's okay. Examine your bias. This is a really big one right now in our world in general, and I think it's extra big in the death care world. So many of us are groovy white women, and we can be so hard to approach in our communities. And so when we are putting ourselves out in our neighborhoods, in the local places where we live as community death care advocates, and I don't want to go into a whole examining bias thing right now. The NHFA will be putting on relevant topics with that throughout the year. But please search out books, webinars, and things like that to really look at, as a death care provider, what are the ways that I'm presenting? What's the language that I'm using that's making it so that only a very particular type of person is willing to ask me questions? Because so much of the knowledge that you hold is important to everybody. And so it's up to us to understand where we are putting boundaries between ourselves and other communities that maybe don't look like us or communicate in the same ways as we do. Maybe we have too many words on our website, and people who, have brain injury have a hard time taking in information that way. Think about that. Make sure you're also doing some videos on your website. Looking at the ways that where are you advertising? What spaces are you teaching in? And really look across your community to see how you can partner with other organizations who are doing outreach, and be invited by those organizations to speak to their members. So examine yourself, examine bias, and make sure that you are putting yourself in places where you might feel uncomfortable as a way to reach out and connect with people who are not normally who are gravitating to your work. Offer education. Teach. Offer it for free, offer it for $5, offer it for $50, and just get yourself out there. Make connections with other death workers, yes, including funeral directors. So if there's other death doulas, hopefully you're not seeing those people as competition, but as ways that you can come together and work together. Make friends with hospice nurses, funeral directors, medical examiners. These people are so interesting and curious. And I think that the more connections that you make in your community, the more resources you'll have to offer the families that make their way to you. Explore community care approaches. What are other things that you can be doing in your community to help support people who are just going through rough times? that aren't death related, but then you start to be seen in your community as someone who's trusted, as someone to lean into when things get hard. And that can be offering food, offering rides to medical visits and things like that. So what are the different ways that you show up in your community? And that'll also help you be more trusted. Embrace advocacy as a way to broaden the cultural approach to death care options where you live. And so someone like another way I could have written that sentence is like, embrace advocacy as a marketing tool. For those of you who are trying to make money at this work, advocacy is a marketing tool. The more you change the culture where you live to have a broader approach to death and options, the more people are going to want your services. The more of an impression that you make as a professional when dealing with the hospital and helping them have a better policy about body release, the more they might be like, oh, this family really could use some more support. Maybe this isn't a doctor who would often recommend a death doula or a palliative care doc, but he's like, and that person who was in here, they made an impression on me. They were very professional. I kind of thought death doulas were weird, but they impressed me. So your advocacy becomes a great marketing tool. Oh, I went backwards. Okay. All right. So what do we as death workers need to offer our communities to ensure that where we live is a great place to die? And that term, where we live is a great place to die, is something that I came up with when I started doing death work. And it was right after that baby died when I was the midwife. And what I realized was like, holy shit, like I just watched an entire community fall apart when this baby died. I watched this couple lose their friends. I watched friends work through their own shame around not knowing how to show up for people. And then I had this moment, this total freak out moment of like, do you know how much I love my children? Like, I live in a town, like if my kids die, like I am going down. And so it's like, okay, I know that I live in like a realm where children die. And now I know very, very clearly that I live in a community where my friends do not know what to do with me if that horrible thing happens. And it was this like, it was almost like my personal death work became this selfish act of like, I got to get this community's act together because like all these beings that I love are vulnerable. And if something should happen, like I'm screwed. So it became my mission to like, I want to live in a place where experiences of death don't mean that people are abandoned. That mean that like people don't have to turn to substance abuse because they can turn to their families and to their communities. So I really started asking this question of like, what does it look like to live someplace that's a great place to die? What options would be there, right? Do you have a beautiful green cemetery? If that's something that's important to you as an option. Do you have great funeral directors around who make the transition between I want to do this much myself and this much with support really easy and flowy? Do we have a language around grief? Do we know how to support each other when the worst thing happens and not just say the wrong thing or be so afraid to say the wrong thing that we don't show up? To me, those are the elements of a really important culture that would meet death. And like, how would that trickle in to all of the other aspects of living well? So my conclusion, you'll have your own conclusions, was the big one is having folks in my community who know how to be with grief, their own and mine. Having institutions that understand families' rights with regard to after-death care. And 3, having access to options and experiences that allow for a satisfying transition. And that last one is really broad on purpose, right? Because like I say, for me, like I love green burial grounds, right? So like that's really important to me, but that's not relevant in every community. That's not relevant in every city, right? But so really looking at like, what are the options that are possible where I find myself, right? That's why the NHFA can't do it on its own, because I don't know each of your communities. What would it look like in my community? What are the options that could be here? And how do I work to make sure that there's more options available? How do I help the institutions understand families' rights? And how do I teach people to be with grief? Those are the answers for me to those questions. This is the organization that I've started here in Prescott. It's actually, you know, obviously it's all of Arizona. And I'm sharing it because I really like what we put together here as our definition of community death care, right? So community death care comes from a belief that our culture is missing out on deep experiences of meaning when we are uninformed in times of tragedy, life-changing diagnosis, caregiving, death, and grief. We are a group of local volunteers, educators, healthcare workers, and curious humans dedicated to making a difference in the lives of our neighbors, friends, and community members. We offer informational classes, facilitated conversations, advocacy, and policy consulting for hospitals and care homes. We offer step-by-step guidance for families curious about caring for their own loved ones after death, whether for emotional, spiritual, financial, or environmental reasons. Arizona Community Death Care is a resource for anyone thinking about or facing end of life. So I invite you to use, you know, as you're developing whatever approaches you are taking to advocacy and education in your hometown, to steal as much of this as you want. Our website is azcommunitydeathcare.org, and what we've created is a website that looks very much like the NHFA website. Is just specific to Arizona. Steal it. Reach out to me, ask me questions, but I really hope that this is the model that we're moving towards in death care. Okay, how are we doing? I'm going to try to get through here so I have lots of time for your questions. So to me, the work of community death care is to support the formation of systems that respect options and increase access. That is advocacy, right? So I've said this a lot, but your advocacy work includes reaching out to hospitals and care homes, making sure they understand, especially families' rights to after-death care, because that's where there are the most barriers. Find allies in those communities, find allies in your hospital, find allies in your care homes, in the medical examiner's office. Write to the newspaper and smaller independent publications. Don't wait, right? This is the big one. Do it now. The folks that I was helping last week, my class 2 years ago, and they knew that their grandma was on hospice. And I said in the class that I was teaching, you know, don't wait, talk to the hospice, talk to the hospitals near you, let them know that there are people who live in your community who are going to want to care for their own loved ones after death, and start paving the way now. Well, they didn't wait. And then I was on the phone with all of these people, which I didn't mind doing. But the point is to really do this work before there's a body that's trying to get brought home from the hospital, before there's a body at the medical examiner's office and the medical examiner's going, oh, I don't think the family wants to see this body. This body doesn't look very good. And you're going, thank you so much for your care. They know what they can handle. Right? And so you're bridging these gaps, but we're doing the education hopefully before the body is there. Connect with vital records and medical examiners, make sure they have policies in place. Contact places of worship, make sure that they are open to, you know, working directly with families to have services, and not just funeral directors. And my favorite one, this is again the NHFA goal for 2021, is for all of us to be working to get the National Home Funeral Alliance on hospice resource documents. So when somebody gets a folder when they're first coming on hospice, one of the things that's in that folder is a list of the local funeral directors. That's on almost every hospice pamphlet. So my goal is that somewhere there is, and if you'd like to care for your own, here's a link to the National Home Funeral Alliance website. They can help you realize some alternatives. And then if you end up making a more state-specific site, like the one that we have here in Arizona, hopefully you can put that there as well. And I'm just going to check, my computer just got dim for a second. I want to make sure that I am, ooh, something's going on with my plug. Excuse me 1 second. I'm going to make sure I'm plugged in. Figured it out. Sorry about that. You know, your computer goes dim when it's about to die, and I'm like, I know my computer's plugged in, but the little thing wasn't fully pushed in. Whew, that would have been a bummer if I went away. Okay. Okay. Access. Help reach beyond your borders. Do your own bias work, examine your privilege, and really, really think about and manage cultural appropriation. If you don't know what those things are, that's a great place to start. Your homework is to just Google that tonight. Offer volunteer service to those who can't pay. Partner with other community outreach groups. When you support your community will support you. So don't worry about scarcity and not getting paid. Remember that the more you put yourself out in the community, the more you'll be trusted and the more people will seek out your services. Really look at, where do you offer your events and where do you advertise? Are you in places where a diverse community of people will feel comfortable being? Is it a place where people who have a harder time hearing, is there a lot of background noise and so it's hard for them to access your information? Is it easy for people to move around the space? Are the chairs comfortable? Make sure that you have a variety of different places where you present this information, so that if some people aren't comfortable at this bookstore, but at the the community room at the library might be more accessible to other people. So really make sure that you're putting yourself out there in a variety of places. Oh, went the other way. This is we will be doing. I think that our March webinar will be all about grief and grief education at NHFA. But this, to me, is all I want to talk about, because really, whether it's advocating for people to spend time with bodies, whether it's teaching people the right things to say, and that it's okay to feel horrible sitting in a room with someone who just had a terrible loss, but that it's worth it. This is the essence of the work that we're doing. How are you learning enough about the language of grief to offer that to your community, so that when there is a big loss, there are some people who are fluent enough in the language of grief support to show up for people. In my experiences, one of the best gifts we offer the bereaved, the actual person grieving, is a roadmap to grief for their friends, for their dearest friends and for their trusted family. That is what I find is the most unsatisfying part, besides the trauma of losing somebody. When you have to teach people, when you have to teach your friends how to even be in the same room with you because of what you've gone through, that's a huge burden. And so I think that as death doulas, as home funeral guides, we reach out to the circle of people that's closest to the bereaved and help them have the language of caring. I've actually started meeting with, the bereaved family, and I ask them to identify their closest 3 to 5 to 8 people. And then I invite them, with the bereaved couple doesn't even need to be there. The bereaved humans don't need to be there. And I do a meeting just on how to manage grief, just on how to be with grief and bear witness to grief for the people who are going to be closest to the person who's just had the loss. This is really important, especially when there's trauma, when there's a death that was not expected. Okay, so we offer this roadmap, and the why, because when we offer this skill, we are planting seeds in the community. We are strengthening friendships, fostering support networks, and helping families to be essential structures once more. Right? Like, I love us. I love the death doulas and the home funeral guides and the celebrants. But what I really love is like families and communities that know how to do this for each other. And so I think that what we're doing as educators is planting these seeds and teaching people how to be friends again. Teaching people how to be family again and in community with each other again. And then we spread exponentially in these little ripples, because now those 8 people that were in that circle with me have a skill that they didn't have of navigating grief. And so then when more tragedy happens, these people are out there teaching each other. I think it's really lovely. Here's what we know. Advocacy, education, and access improve experiences at end of life. We know that art makes a difference. We know that as humans called to serve the dying and their communities, we are able to encourage trust in the process, so there can be a shift in the conventional way of meeting end of life. People who understand the landscape of grief make great friends. I feel like I want to make a bumper sticker that says that, because that's who I want to be my friend. The people who are okay with grief, people who can deal with the fact that sometimes I cry and nothing's even wrong. Those are the good friends. And the strong knowing that community death care is social justice. The ways that we increase access, the ways that we make sure that people know their rights, those are acts of social justice. And I highly recommend that we dive into that aspect of this work a little bit more. Okay. So why is a family's knowledge of their right to care for their loved one after death such an important part of community death care? There's my daughter and grandma again. I love this picture because I think that it's this seed of this little woman, you know, who's learning how to be a member of my family in a different way than she would have had she not had this experience. My grandmother was a really challenging person to be in relationship with. There was a lot of trauma surrounding being her daughter or her granddaughter. The fact that we had this home funeral, there were little cracks in that concrete of hardness and meanness, because those things were very present. And when we live in communities where there are opportunities, excuse me, for that movement, for that healing, right? Whatever you want to call it. Our communities are stronger because we have opportunities to deal with our shit. And sometimes we can't deal with our shit with people until they're dead, because the things don't move until the end. Maybe there's such an abuse cycle that the person needs to go for there to be those opportunities to see who we become. And that's a really strong foundation for community. I like to remember that we've been doing this work for a really long time. Like since we were our ancient human relatives. One of the main changes that I have friends who are archaeologists, and we nerd out on this stuff a lot. And one of the things that they notice from us being more like animals to being more like humans was we started caring for the dead. That was like an archaeological discovery, was that right around the time that humans started to make art in graves, we were changing from our more animal-like selves to our more human-like selves. And I love this, hold the heavy in your hands so you don't only grapple with it in your mind. And I love this image of these people with the rocks. And when I teach the longer form of this, there's this beautiful story of this young girl takes place on an island, and she has to bury her grandmother. And she talks about the act of going and looking for the rock and carrying the rock and putting it on her grandma, and going and getting the rock and carrying the rock and putting it on her grandma for hours. And by the end of it, she was physically exhausted, but she could finally cry because she did what needed to be done. She served her grandma. She knew grandma will be so proud because I carried the rocks in my hands. And when you're carrying things in your hands, you're not wrestling with them in your mind. And most of the times our minds don't do that well for us in matters of the heart. So this is where I go when I really want to dive into why home funerals, why spending time with bodies are so important for our nervous systems. And I won't get in the weeds with this too much because I do really want to take your question, but this is the work of Stephen Voorhees. And when we are, so the quest for safety, right? This comes directly from like the work of somatic experiencing for those of you who are interested in that kind of trauma work. So that's my other, like, I love trauma work and I love the psychology of all of that. So what we learn in trauma work is that the outside, the environment that we're in, the room you're in, the outdoor space communicates to us if we're okay or not. Is there a person that's making you feel stressed out? Is there a lion behind the tree? Is there a snowstorm coming, an earthquake? What's going on, right? So the outside environment is communicating to our nervous system. Am I safe? Is there danger? Is my life threatened? When we're safe, when we feel safe, we can make eye contact, right? This is what I was talking about in the beginning. We have facial expressions with each other, right? We mimic each other's facial expressions, right? And it helps us relax. When we feel in danger, right, we have these fight or flight behaviors, right? And then when we really are in a bad place, we start to shut down. The leap that I make is for people who don't feel, again, this is about people knowing their rights and then choosing this if this is right for them. I work with a lot of people, especially as a birth midwife, who are not comfortable in institutional settings, in hospitals, in places where there's a perceived authority figure telling you how to manage this really intense moment: death, birth, trauma, accidents, whatever those things are that make us find ourselves in hospitals, in nursing homes, in whatever, in medical examiners' offices. Many people are not in this green safety zone in a place where there's a perceived authority. So our nervous system starts to go into this more fight or flight. It's really hard to grieve in the yellow zone or the red zone. It's really hard to have a satisfying movement of emotion through your body when you're a little bit in fight or flight. And so if you are someone who feels safer at home or at church or in a community center or some other place where you feel safe and have privacy, this is, to me, that's the science question behind why a home funeral may be better for some people's experience of grief. Because when you're home, you can have all the feelings. Nobody's telling you what to do and you're not on anybody's timeline. Home death care supports the grief process in very specific ways. It helps us connect to our most ancient ancestral ways of being. It allows for opportunities of post-traumatic growth. One of the realizations is that the more that you do, the more that you feel like you were involved in the thing and making it better and doing the work, it's possible to have post-traumatic growth rather than post-traumatic stress. Doesn't always happen. It's not a guarantee, but the more physical work, the more you feel like you had value, the more opportunities you have for growth. Not necessarily healing, but growth. They allow events to unfold naturally as a manifestation of the moment. You may have no idea what you're going to experience. So better to just let the things happen. This is my favorite. Titrate the intensity of the experience, which supports the nervous system. So titrate is when you take something strong and you weaken it a little bit so that it's more manageable. So when we titrate the experience of death, right, this is like, I'm going to sit with the body of my loved one and read a poem and sing a song. And then I need a break. So because I'm home and I know the hospital's not like chomping at the bit to like bring the body down to the morgue, I can go walk the dog or wash the dishes. I can go do something normal, which signals to my nervous system that I'm okay, that I did something valuable. So my nervous system is maybe a little bit heightened because I'm like in the room with this dead person and I'm really sad and I'm crying and I'm processing, and I go walk the dog and the nervous system settles. And then I'm settled and I can go back in and I can go back up and I can be buzzing again a little bit. And then I can go settle. And that is actually a way that somatic experiencing therapists help work with people who are stuck in a trauma response. It's like this pendulation of like, but see, you can settle. And then you can get activated and then you can settle. And if we get stuck in an activated state, it's harder to feel all the things. So I won't go too deep because again, I can talk about just that for like 3 hours. There's so much there, but just know that taking the time, going into the experience and being able to leave and come back, you're actually training your nervous system that it can do hard things. You know, like you can do hard things. That's what you're telling your nervous system. See, this is hard. And then I leave and walking the dog feels good. Being in the room with the death feels weird. Walking the dog feels good. And your nervous system learns that it's capable of being on different settings. And that's growth. Okay, we're almost to the end here. This is wonderful, Stephen Jenkinson, right? The mark of a good death is that it is a village-making experience. Death is not a mistake. It is not something that the world shouldn't have. It serves a purpose and it brings people together when it's done right. And excuse me, I don't believe in right, but you know what he means, right? When we do something that has work in it, when we do something that allows us to feel the hard feelings without losing control, to feel like we have agency, to feel like we aren't being taken over by an authority figure, but that we're working together with resources in our community. That's maybe what being done right means. But the way that you know is you leave feeling like, oh, I learned something there about myself, about my community, and I want to go deeper. And here's my final slide. Here's to Sarah Cruz. A friend is someone who will help you move, and a real friend is someone who will help you move a body. And that to me sums up community death care. All right, my dears. Thank you so much for being here. I am not even sure now, since we've dwindled down to just those of us that are here right now. How about, is there anybody here who has a question, either that they put in the chat earlier, or and they want to just speak or point to something in the chat? I'd love to just hear where you're at and what you need and what more I can answer for you. So you can just raise your Zoom hand or your human hand, because I've got y'all on one screen now. How's everybody doing? Everybody's all right. I got some thumbs up. Great. Feel free to unmute if you want, and I'll just scroll here through. My dog was sick. I knew she was dying. I started preparing her grave weeks in advance, collected the items. I knew that I wanted to bury with her. Ritual allow us to visit the other realms in ways we don't often. Yes, I love that. Ritual is so important. Yes, death is not a medical emergency. Go ahead, Judith.
I just wanted to say, as somebody who does a lot of funeral vigils, I live in Toronto. I've been practicing as a death midwife for 15 years. And anecdotally, I'm so, I love Porges' work and I study extensively with Gabor Mate, but literally what you've said is so profound and so true as you see people coming and normalizing this time with their loved one and everyone finding their own relationship to the journey from the moment, before and then coming into this relationship. And I like the fact that you're not setting people up that this will be truly healing, but it will be transforming, and it is transforming. And people start coming towards me. I never want to bed another death. This has resolved my mother's bad, horrible death. This bad, people talk about how it's reframed so many poor losses that have followed them over the years and had very little working through it. So thank you so much. It was beautiful to see trauma-informed work and nervous system work integrated into this imagination. Thank you.
Great. I'm so glad that you connected with that. That's my favorite part of this whole thing.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah. I'll just respect everybody's pause here for a second and just see if anybody's waiting for some quiet to have the guts to chime in.
Can I ask a question that's a little off, but kind of it's 10 o'clock, relevant?
Please, Adrian.
Yeah, why is it that like the NH, always get the letters, FA now charges for their trainings, like these type of little gatherings? Like, why is there like that little, it's a nominal fee, but it is a fee. I'm just curious.
Yeah, that's a great question. We only ever really did webinars during our fundraising week. We would kind of do this like 1 week long. They were free, but we were always asking for donations. And it felt like this thing we were trying to just like pull together. And we realized that we wanted to have the opportunity to reach out monthly. We were doing calls sometimes, and those kind of got boring, especially once video conferencing kind of took off. And so, yeah, so honestly, we are a nonprofit with all volunteers, no paid staff. And so fundraising is hard. Fundraising is real when you're running a nonprofit, especially with volunteers. And so we felt it was an experiment that we did a year ago to say, what would it look like if we charged $10? Most people can afford $10. And we released them for free a year later. So the webinar the information does become free in a year. And we felt like it was a thing to try to see if we could support ourselves and our work by offering this to people. And it got such a great response. We actually realized that more people came, and we hear this all the time, more people came when we charged a little bit than when they were free, which is just y'all's weird psychology. But yeah, and we are actually, one of our initiatives, we're about to do a little fundraising drive in the spring, and one of the things that we'll really be focusing on is having more ways to access our information for free. So whether it's scholarships to these little $10 things, and really being able to have scholarships to our conference, which will be happening in the fall. Open your newsletters because there'll be information coming about the conference in the next couple months. But yeah, really making sure that access is what we're addressing this year. So yes, so hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, were you able to access the old ones? I would love that. Like, where do you get the old ones?
Yeah, we have a YouTube channel. Okay. So it's the NHFA YouTube channel, and there's tons of free videos on there. And I think that we've now we only did like 4 videos last year, and I think that those are all on there now. We did a great conversation, my favorite, with Elizabeth Heinemann, who actually wrote a book about the stillbirth of her son and the experience that she had with his body at home and how important that was. So there's an interview with her on there. So great stuff on the NHFA YouTube channel. And then this year's webinars will start to show up, or last year's webinars will start to show up soon.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. So I just, it's, in this work, there's so much education, there's so much networking and not as many clients. So I have to find that balance between, like paying and, versus receiving a client. So I just had a client. So I'm like, okay, I could do a little paid training now. So thank you for that answer.
You're
I appreciate
welcome. Yeah. And please, if there's ever anything that you are interested in that we're doing and you're like, I really want to be there and I don't have $10, send me an email and we'll make it work. We'll make it work. Yeah. Karen, are you saying bye or raising your hand?
Oh, I'm raising my hand.
Yay, go ahead, Karen.
I was just going to ask if you have anything coming up that could explore more fully some of the things that you were talking about earlier about the barriers and hoops that the licensed funeral directors and the funeral industry, as well as even medical examiners, coroners, hospitals, the whole thing about saying, oh, you can't do this. I mean, I have seen cemeterians who say, this is absolutely, you can't do this. You can't do a natural burial. It's just can't be done. And so many people, if they don't have an advocate, if they don't know that there's advocates that can help them navigate all of this stuff, they end up paying a huge fee for something they don't want. And then all of the things that you discussed. And I mean, it's really hard. And I have found that nobody around here anyway, even though we have 2 natural burial grounds and a lot of people who have created a lot of buzz about home funerals too. A lot of all of our funeral directors have natural burial packages and things like that, but they will not do anything a la carte. So if you wanted, like you were saying about transporting your grandmother from the home to the cemetery, that would cost $4,000, which, it's really, it could be maybe $200 fee, but anyway, I'd love to explore all of that more. You were talking about the Utah situation where you were talking to people about, no, this is really illegal. So that's an area.
Yeah, so we do have, and LaShawna, I'm glad you came in at just the perfect moment because you can remind me if you can think of we do have our lineup for the year planned for a lot of these webinars, and there is one that's particularly geared towards how to build relationships with specifically funeral directors. So we will definitely be talking about that with a panel of funeral directors later in the year. And then the other one that's coming to mind, LaShawna, is the things that are not illegal, that might be an opportunity to really dive into, like, how do we pull apart the fact that this isn't illegal and how do we talk about it? What's the language that we use when we're talking to people who are in policy positions, to help them do that consulting piece of, like, you can bring your loved one's body home, and yes, hospital ethics team, this is what the policy needs to say, this is what it needs to be worded as, this is why. And yeah, I'm sure we can pull that into that. And is there anything else you can think of, LaShawna, that's in that realm?
I think really, really making sure that you know the nuanced laws of where you live. Not just what it says on paper, but have with you the forms, right? So if you need a body transport permit in order to move your person, what does it take to get that permit? Who do you have to know? In the state of
but even they don't, in my experience, I've gone to the Vital Records office and spent the afternoon educating them about what they provide to people. And, they had no idea that they even had this paperwork that needed to be completed. They didn't know what it meant. They didn't know how to access it.
Yep. No, and I think we can pull that apart a little bit more in that future webinar.
There's a question.
Go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so I just wanted to comment on one thing. For the community outreach, I had my degree in mortuary science. I was a licensed funeral director. And one of the things that you can do in your area as far as building a relationship with funeral directors is finding a accredited mortuary science program, and actually talking to the program directors to do a talk with the students and really educate them as to this is an option. And that way the future funeral directors out there will know that that's an option, and you're building it before they get out into the real world as far as the practicing of it goes. And one more thing is that I live here in Maricopa County, a little bit south of you, Dani.
Yeah.
And the medical examiner's office here, they take volunteers, and that was I was a volunteer there for a year in the exams. One, it gets you really good hands-on experience as far as the practicalities of the death care and if there's ever a traumatic death you're dealing with, but it's also a good way to build repertoires with the people who actually work there, because you're there working there side by side with them, volunteering your time and being able to educate them on the home funeral process options as well, if you ever are with the family picking somebody up from there.
I think that's a great idea. And that speaks to like what we were talking about before, right? Of like the more you get in, like your advocacy work becomes your marketing. So, and so, it's like you start to build relationships in these places and people trust you, and that ends up being a great asset. I think that's a really great suggestion. Thanks for saying it.
When you work from like an educational standpoint and sharing that education instead of marketing, so many facilities and locations and places are like, oh, you want to share some knowledge? Okay, let's do that, instead of like, let's trade business cards and call me when you need me. And you're giving such a gift, especially like if you're educating the vital records department, like what a gift to not just that person, but everybody else who now gets the benefit because they know.
I see Sarita is raising a hand. Go ahead.
Where did she just say she volunteered at?
The Maricopa County Medical Examiner's Office. They're at our county medical examiner's office. You can volunteer at several different places. I have volunteered both in exams and in the front office. So getting experience with the paperwork side of things as well as the body care stuff 2 days a week.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah. Wonderful. All right, well, it's 8 o'clock. 8 o'clock here.
Here.
10 o'clock in some places. So thank you all so much for sticking through this with me. It was fun to talk at you. And yeah, it's good to connect. I appreciate all the questions and the thoughts. The NHFA is here for you. Like I said, we're great at that phone help. So, if you're dipping your toe in and you just need some backup, you can reach out to us at our info@homefuneralalliance.org email. We have phone numbers and are always, willing to pick up the phone and do the advocacy work, talk you through weird situations. But definitely the NHFA is here for you. So if you're not already on our mailing list, get on that for free, through our website, and just stay in touch, because I think that together, the death doula world and the home funeral educator world, it's really together that we're starting to make things shift in the ways that people, see their options. So thanks for being here with me tonight. And please feel free to reach out with questions that end up lingering at 2 o'clock in the morning. Bye.